The rain came down in silver sheets the morning Matthew Barker rode out to the Covington farm, and it was the kind of rain that soaked through a man's coat and made him question every decision he had ever made in his life. It was the spring of 1882, in the wide red dirt country of northwestern Texas, where the Llano Estacado gave way to rolling grassland, and the sky sat so close to the earth that a person could almost believe they were inside a painting. The town of Harlan Creek sat 7 miles to the east, a modest collection of timber buildings and one paved main street that flooded every time the sky opened up like this, which it had a habit of doing in April without warning or mercy. Matthew Barker was 28 years old, broad in the shoulder and lean everywhere else, with dark hair that curled against his collar when it was wet, which it very much was that morning. He rode a bay gelding named Porter and carried in his coat pocket a folded paper that he had been trying not to think about since Judge Alderman pressed it into his hands 2 days prior. The paper was a notice of debt collection, legally signed and stamped with the county seal, authorizing Matthew in his capacity as the county's appointed debt agent to reclaim one gray mule, known locally as Old Scratch, from the property of one Mabel Covington, widow, in satisfaction of a loan of $42.60 made to the late Henry Covington by First Bank of Harlan Creek, said loan having gone unpaid for 11 months and now in default. Matthew had not wanted the job when Judge Alderman handed it to him. He had opened his mouth to say so, and then caught the look in the judge's eye, the kind of look that reminded a man how few options existed for someone of his particular circumstances, and he had folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket without saying anything at all. He had asked around town about Mabel Covington the evening before, because he had learned early in this line of work that knowing something about a person made the hard parts less likely to go sideways. What he had gathered was scattered and not especially encouraging. Henry Covington had died the previous autumn of a fever that moved fast. He had left behind a wife and 160 acres of hard clay soil, and a loan he had taken to buy that mule and the seed corn and a new set of harnesses, all of it borrowed against a harvest that the drought had made small and the subsequent fever had made impossible to sell on time. Mabel Covington had stayed on through the winter. People in town said she was stubborn. Reverend Poole's wife said she was brave. Old Clyde Harmon at the feed store said she was the kind of woman who would die on that land before she let anyone take a thing from it. Matthew had listened to all of it, and then he had gone home to his rented room above the hardware store and lain awake a good portion of the night. He saw the farm first through the gray curtain of rain, a low-built house of limestone and cedar with a good tin roof, and a barn that leaned slightly but had held through winter. The fence lines were straight, which told him something. A kitchen garden ran along the south side of the house, and even through the rain he could see that it had been tended carefully, with small wooden stakes marking rows and the first green shoots of spring pressing up through the wet soil. He turned his horse toward the fields behind the barn, and that was when he saw her. Mabel Covington was plowing in the rain. She was working a single-bottom plow behind the gray mule, and she was moving across the far end of the field in a straight, determined line, her back bent against the weight of the handles, her boots sinking into the mud with each step. She wore a man's hat that had gone dark with water and a heavy canvas coat that was soaked through entirely, and her dark hair had come loose from whatever she had pinned it with that morning, and it lay against her neck and shoulders in wet ropes. The mule, Old Scratch, was doing what the mule apparently did, which was pulling hard and steady regardless of the weather, and Mabel was doing what she apparently did, which was keeping up. Matthew stopped his horse at the edge of the field and sat there. He had the paper in his pocket. He had ridden 7 miles in the rain with a lawful purpose and a county authorization and a job that needed doing. He watched her make the turn at the far end of the field, wrestling the plow around with her whole body, speaking something low to the mule that Matthew could not hear over the rain and the wind, and then she started back up the row, and her jaw was set, and her shoulders were set, and everything about her said that she had decided to plow this field today regardless of what the sky decided to do about it. And Matthew Barker sat on his horse and could not make himself speak the words. He could not do it. He sat there for what felt like a long time, long enough that Porter shifted beneath him and blew out a breath, and the rain came down harder for a moment and then softened again. And still Matthew did not call out to her, did not ride forward, did not reach for the paper in his pocket. Mabel reached the near end of the row and looked up and saw him. She stopped. She did not startle, which surprised him. She just stopped and looked at him across the rain-soaked earth with brown eyes that were direct and entirely without pretense. And after a moment she said, loud enough to carry through the weather, "You going to sit there, or you going to say what you came to say?" Matthew opened his mouth. He closed it. He got down off his horse. He walked to the edge of the field and stopped there, his boots at the boundary of the plowed ground, and he looked at her and she looked at him, and the rain fell between them like a curtain made of something important. "Ma'am," he said, "my name is Matthew Barker." "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was even but not cold. It was the voice of a woman who had decided some time ago that she was not going to spend her available energy on being afraid. "You ride for the bank. I work for the county," he said carefully. "There is a difference." "Is there?" He did not have a good answer for that. Mabel reached up and pushed her wet hair back from her face with one muddy forearm, and she looked at him with an expression that was patient and exhausted in equal measure, the expression of a woman who had been waiting for something unpleasant to arrive, and was relieved in a grim way that it had finally done so. "You are here about the mule," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at Old Scratch, who was standing with characteristic stubbornness in the rain, ears flat, not particularly distressed about any of this. "I have 60 acres left to plow," she said. "The window for corn planting in this country is about 3 weeks. After that, the yield drops by half for every week I wait. I cannot plant without the mule, and I cannot live through another year without a crop." Matthew knew all of that. He had grown up on a farm 40 miles south, and he knew exactly what she was saying. He stood in the rain with the paper in his pocket, and he said nothing. "I am not asking you to forget your job," she said. "I am asking you to tell me what I owe and what time I have." He reached into his pocket and took out the paper. He unfolded it carefully, though the rain was already beginning to blur the edges, and he read the figures to her plainly. $42.60 principal, $4.20 accrued interest, total of $46.80. She absorbed this. "And if I cannot pay," she said. "The mule is the collateral," he said. "They want it returned to the bank's holding pen by the end of this month." "That's 16 days, she said. "Yes, ma'am." She was quiet for a moment. The rain eased slightly, and the world smelled of wet clay and new grass and something green and alive that had no name. "Mr. Barker," she said at last, "I do not have $46.80. I do not have $46. I have $11 and some change in a tin in my kitchen, and I have a smokehouse with enough salt pork to last me till summer, and I have 60 acres of unplowed ground and 3 weeks to plant it in." "I understand," he said. "Do you?" He looked at her. He looked at the field. He looked at the gray mule standing patient in the rain. "I am going to ask you something," he said slowly, "and I want you to know I am not asking it to be cruel or to make your situation worse." She waited. "Is there anyone who could help you? Family, neighbor, anyone who could lend or gift you some portion of what is owed?" She shook her head, and it was not a defeated shake, just an honest one. "My sister is in Missouri and has 5 children and no surplus. Henry's brother is in Abilene, and we have not spoken since Henry passed. My nearest neighbor is Walt Prout, and he lost his barn in February and is rebuilding from nothing. There is no one." Matthew folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. He stood in the rain for a moment that stretched in a way that felt significant, and then he did something that surprised himself almost as much as it surprised her. "Ma'am," he said, "I have today free. I mean I have no other pressing business." and I noticed that your plow could use another set of hands at the other end of the field, or at least another pair of arms when you make your turns." She stared at him. "I am not offering to forget the debt," he said quickly. "I cannot do that, and I would not insult you by pretending otherwise. But the paper says end of the month, and it is the 14th today, and between now and then I might find myself back on this road more than once." Something moved in her expression. It was not gratitude exactly, or not only that. It was something more careful and more complicated, and it made him look away for a moment toward the middle distance. "You would plow in the rain," she said. "I have plowed in worse." There was a long pause. "All right, Mr. Barker," she said at last. "I will not say no to help that is offered honestly." He tied Porter to the fence post and rolled up what remained of his dry sleeves, which was not much, and he went out into the field and got to work. The morning passed in labor and rain. Matthew took the handles when she needed rest, and she directed him on the field's particular temperament, where the clay ran hard and where it softened over the buried creek line, where the rocks lurked just below the surface, and where the grade shifted and made the plow want to pull left. Old Scratch was exactly as advertised, steady and powerful and occasionally contrary, and Matthew found himself talking to the mule in a low voice the way he had talked to the plow animals of his youth, and the mule seemed to accept this. They did not talk much at first. The work demanded attention, and the rain demanded tolerance, and there was a particular kind of companionship that existed between people doing hard physical work side by side that did not require words. But by noon, when the rain had thinned to a drizzle and they stopped at the edge of the field to let the mule rest, things were different. Mabel brought out a small basket from the house. Cold biscuits, a jar of pickled okra, strips of dried venison that she had put up herself in October. She spread it on the fence rail without ceremony, and they ate standing up with mud to their knees, and somewhere in the course of that meal, they started talking. He found out that she was 26 years old and had come to Texas from Virginia as a girl of 12 when her father decided that the old country was done with him, and the West was not. She had loved the land immediately and completely in the way that children sometimes fall in love with a place and never entirely recover. She had married Henry Covington at 19, and they had spent 7 good years and 2 hard ones on this piece of ground, and she intended to spend the rest of her life here as well. She found out that Matthew had grown up on a farm south of Abilene, that his father had died when he was 20 and his mother had remarried and moved to New Mexico Territory, that he had tried cattle driving for 2 years and found it lonely in a way that wore at him, and that the county debt work was the steadiest employment he had managed to find since then, and that he was not entirely proud of it. "It is honest work," she said. "It is necessary work," he said. "That is not exactly the same thing." She considered that. "No," she agreed. "I suppose it is not." They went back to plowing in the afternoon, and the drizzle faded entirely by 3 in the afternoon, and the sun came out in that particular Texas way, sudden and absolute, as if it had never been anywhere else. The field steamed. The clay began to dry along the surface while staying soft below, which was actually ideal plowing condition, and they made good progress. Matthew stayed until the light went orange and long, and they had covered nearly 8 acres. When he finally went to untie Porter from the fence post, his back ached in a way that he recognized from his boyhood as the specific ache of honest effort, and he found he did not mind it. Mabel walked with him to his horse. "I am obliged to you, Mr. Barker," she said. "Matthew," he said, and then felt that was perhaps forward of him and added, "if that is all right." She looked at him. "Matthew, then, and I am Mabel." He mounted up, and she stood by the fence with her wet coat still on, and her hair not entirely recovered from the day, and she looked directly at him with those frank brown eyes, and he felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he recognized with some alarm as the beginning of a significant problem. He tipped his hat and rode back toward town. The problem did not go away overnight. He lay in his room above the hardware store and stared at the ceiling and thought about a woman plowing a field in the rain, and the way she had not flinched when he told her the amount owed, and the way she had offered him cold biscuits off a fence rail without embarrassment or apology, and the way she had said his name when he told it to her, quietly, and without any particular inflection that he could point to as the cause of the thing happening inside his ribs. He went back the next day. He told himself he was making a professional follow-up. He was, after all, responsible for confirming that the collateral remained on the property through the end of the collection period. This was a perfectly reasonable interpretation of his duties. He repeated this to himself 3 times during the 7-mile ride. She was already in the field when he arrived, which did not surprise him. She had the mule on and was working the north section this time, turning under the remnants of last year's corn stalks, and she looked up when she heard Porter's hooves on the road and raised one hand in greeting without stopping the plow. He tied his horse and went to help. This became the pattern of the days that followed. He came every morning. He stayed until the light failed. Mabel cooked supper on the 3rd day and set a plate for him without making any ceremony of it. Beef stew with dried onions and cornbread, and they ate at the kitchen table in the early dark with a single oil lamp between them, and talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. She told him about Henry. She did it plainly, with the matter-of-fact honesty of someone who had done their grieving in private, and was now able to speak about a person without the speaking pulling them under. Henry had been a good man, she said, steady and kind and better at dreaming than at the details, which had gotten them into the lone situation to begin with, but she did not say that with bitterness. He had loved her well and she had loved him back, and the fever had taken him in 9 days, and she had buried him under the 2 post oak trees at the north end of the property, and that was that. Matthew listened and did not offer easy consolation because she had not asked for any. She asked about his life on the 4th evening, with the directness that he was coming to understand was simply the way she engaged with the world, and he found himself telling her things he had not told anyone in years. About his father, who had been stern but fair, and who had died of a stroke in the field he had spent 40 years working, which Matthew had always thought was both tragic and somehow fitting. About the cattle drives and the loneliness of them, the particular loneliness of being surrounded by men you had nothing in common with except the direction you were all heading, about the county work and the thing it sometimes required of him that sat uneasy, the taking of things from people who had too little to begin with. "Is that what it feels like with this?" she asked. "Taking something from someone who has too little?" He was quiet for a moment. "I did not ride out here expecting to feel the way I feel about it," he said carefully. She looked at him across the table. "And how is that?" she asked. He looked back. "Like I would rather find another solution," he said. The lamp flame moved in some small current of air between them and the shadows shifted, and she held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for a conversation between a debt collector and a woman with an outstanding note. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the McKinley brothers." He waited. "They have been wanting to lease the south 20 acres for their sheep since last fall. Henry always said no because he wanted to run cattle eventually, but I have no cattle and no prospect of cattle, and 20 acres of lease money, even at a modest rate, would go a fair distance toward $46. Matthew sat up straighter. "McKinley's would pay 10 cents an acre per month," she continued. "That is $2 a month. Not nothing, but not $46 either, not in any time frame that would satisfy the bank this month." "No," he agreed, "but there are other options around it. If you could get a partial payment to the bank by the end of the month, say $20, and proof of the lease arrangement as ongoing income, I believe I could make a case to Judge Alderman for an extension of terms." She was very still. "You would do that," she said. "I would make the case," he said. "I cannot promise the judge. But Alderman is not an unreasonable man, and he has ruled against the bank before when the circumstances warranted. If there is a clear path to repayment and the debtor is showing good faith, he sometimes allows an alternative arrangement." She sat back in her chair and looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read. "Matthew Barker," she said slowly, You came out here to take my mule, and you have spent a week plowing my fields, and now you are trying to find me a way out of debt." He felt the back of his neck go warm. "I am doing my job," he said, though they both knew this was not the complete picture. "Your job," she repeated softly. "There is more than one way to satisfy a debt," he said. "Repossessing the mule is the least favorable outcome for everyone involved, including the bank, because a mule that age is not worth $46 at auction. The bank loses money on the transaction. A repayment arrangement that yields the full amount over time is in everyone's interest." "Is that why you keep coming back?" she asked. "To develop a repayment arrangement." The lamp burned between them. Matthew looked at his hands on the table, large and calloused from a week of unexpected field work, and then he looked up at her. "No," he said honestly. The words sat in the air between them for a moment. Then Mabel stood and began clearing the supper dishes, and her movements were deliberate and unhurried, and when she came back to the table for the last of the dishes, her hand passed close to his on the table's surface, not touching but close, and she said, "I will go to see the McKinley brothers in the morning." "I will ride with you if you want company," he said. "I want company," she said. The ride to the McKinley spread took 2 hours the next morning through clear spring air that smelled of cedar and new grass. Thomas McKinley was 40 and careful with money, and he had the perpetual slightly suspicious expression of a man who had been burned on a handshake deal at some point in his life and had not recovered his natural optimism. His brother Frank was younger and easier, and he did most of the talking while Thomas did the arithmetic in his head. The negotiation was cordial in more than 2 hours, and at the end of it, Mabel Covington walked out with a lease agreement for the South 20 acres at 12 cents per acre per month, which was $2.40 per month, beginning June 1st, with a 6-month commitment and right of renewal. She got into the wagon with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, and she waited until they were around the bend in the road before she let out a long breath and said, "They almost wouldn't do it." "They did it," Matthew said. "Thomas McKinley thinks women should not be running farms alone," she said. "I could see it in the way he kept looking past me at you." "He looked at the agreement in front of him," Matthew said. "Whatever he thinks about women running farms, he knows good grazing land when he sees it." She turned to look at him with a small, dry smile. "You are diplomatic, Matthew Barker." "I try to be useful," he said. She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, a full and real sound that did something to the quality of the light around them, and he stored it away like a man who suspects he may need to live on a particular memory for a long time. He made his case to Judge Alderman 2 days later. He laid out the facts clearly and without embellishment. The widow Covington had $11 in hand. She would have the South 20 acres leased beginning June 1st at $2.40 per month. She had 60 acres of corn in the ground, weather permitting, which would yield a harvestable crop in late August. She was a competent farmer, the evidence of which was a week of plowing done in adverse conditions with exactly 1 mule and no additional help beyond a county agent who had been moved by professional obligation to lend a hand. Judge Alderman leaned back in his chair and looked at Matthew for a long moment. "A county agent," he said. "Yes, sir. A county agent who has spent a week in the widow Covington's field." "I was verifying the condition of the collateral," Matthew said. Alderman made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "I will tell you what I will do," the judge said. "I will authorize a 30-day extension contingent on receipt of $11 as a good-faith partial payment by end of this month. That leaves a balance of $35 and some change to be satisfied by September 1st. If she has the lease money coming in and a crop coming in, that is a realistic figure." Matthew felt something release in his chest. "I will carry the terms to her today," he said. "Matthew," the judge said, and Matthew paused at the door. "When you take those terms out there, you might also mention that you are a single man of reasonable character and employed status." Matthew turned. The judge was looking at his papers. "Just as a professional courtesy," the judge said without looking up. Matthew rode to the Covington farm in the early afternoon with the sun overhead and wildflowers beginning along the road, the kind of spring day that made even a worried man's heart lift slightly. He found Mabel in the barn repairing a harness with a leather needle and waxed cord, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hair pulled back neatly. She looked up when he came in. "What did he say?" she asked. "He told her the terms." She listened with the same stillness she always had, processing things completely before she responded, and when he finished she set down the harness and the needle and pressed her palms flat on the workbench. $35 by September 1st, she said. With the lease income starting June 1st, that is 6 months times $2.40, which is $14.40. The corn harvest, even a modest one, should bring the remainder. She nodded slowly. "She keeps her mule," he said, and was surprised by the warmth that came into his voice on that sentence. "She keeps her mule," she confirmed, and her voice was warm too, and for a moment they were both smiling at a sentence that they both knew was about more than the mule. "Mabel," he said, and something about the way he said it this time was different from all the other times he had said it this week, different in a way that both of them noticed. She looked at him. "I rode out here 12 days ago with a paper in my pocket and no particular opinion about any of this," he said. "And I find that I have developed considerable opinions about several things." She waited, in that way she had. "I would like to know," he said, "whether you have any objection to my coming out here after the end of this month without a paper in my pocket." She was quiet for long enough that he started to regret the entire speech. Then she said, "I would find it difficult to object to something I have been hoping for." He looked at her. She looked back at him with those frank brown eyes that never hid anything they meant. And the afternoon light came through the barn door behind him and lay across the floor in a long gold rectangle, and the horses stood quietly in their stalls, and the whole world was very still. He took one step toward her and she held her ground, which he had expected, because she held her ground about everything. "I should tell you," he said, his voice lower now, "that I have never been particularly good at the easy parts. I'm better at hard work and poor at the charming parts." "I have not found you lacking in any category so far," she said. He reached up and touched her jaw with one hand, very gently, the way a man touches something he is afraid of damaging. She turned her face slightly into his hand. He kissed her. Softly and with great attention, the way he did every task he considered important, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to all other things, and the barn smelled of leather and horse and spring air, and somewhere outside Old Scratch made a sound that might have been a pinion. They broke apart and she was smiling and he was smiling, and outside the day was impossibly beautiful. "You should know," she said, "that I am not a woman who does anything by half measures." "I have gathered that," he said. "If you come out here after the end of this month without a paper in your pocket," she said, "you should have a clear sense of your intentions." "They are clear," he said. "Tell me," she said. He looked at her without any hedging or qualification. "I intend to come out here as often as you will have me. I intend to continue being useful where I can. I intend to learn every particular and temperament of this farm and the woman who runs it. And I intend to ask you, at a point that seems right to both of us, whether you would want a partner in the whole enterprise." She was quiet for a moment. "That is clear," she said. He left that evening in the long gold light of late afternoon, and he rode the 7 miles back to town with a lighter heart than he had carried in as long as he could remember. The month ended. He delivered Mabel's $11 payment to the bank himself and had a conversation with the bank manager, a small, careful man named Cresswell, that was professional and moderately tense. Cresswell did not particularly like the extension arrangement, but the judge's authorization left him no room to argue, and Matthew did not give him any either. He rode to the farm the following Saturday with no paper in his pocket, and a clean shirt under his coat, and a small package from the mercantile that contained a pound of good coffee and a jar of sourwood honey, both of which he understood from their conversations she found difficult to afford but enjoyed considerably. She was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, staking bean vines, and she looked up at him when he came through the gate and at the package in his hand and said, "What's that?" he told her. She took the coffee first and held it and breathed it in the way people breathe things they love. "You are going to make this very difficult," she said. "Good," he said. They had supper and talked until the lamp burned low and he rode home in the dark. He came back the following Saturday and the one after that, and by early June the whole county had a general understanding of the situation, which Matthew learned primarily from the knowing looks of Judge Alderman and the pointed questions of everyone at the feed store. He did not particularly mind. There was a dance in town on the third Saturday of June, held in the big barn behind the livery stable, as was the custom in Harlan Creek every summer when the planting was done, and before the real heat set in. Matthew asked Mabel if she would go with him, and she said yes so easily that he felt slightly ridiculous for having prepared a speech. He arrived at her farm early enough to help her hitch the wagon, and she came out of the house in a dress he had not seen before, dark blue with small white flowers, and her hair was up in a way he had not seen before either, and he stood by the wagon and forgot for a moment what he was supposed to be doing. "The horse needs hitching," she said helpfully. He hitched the horse. The dance was loud and bright and full of people who had been cooped up through a long, hard winter and were determinedly happy about the warmth. Mabel knew more people than Matthew did, which he had expected, and she introduced him around with a composure that told him she had thought about how she would handle this and had decided on straightforward. "This is Matthew Barker," she said to each person they met. "Not my debt agent, not the county man, not anything with a qualifier that reduced the thing to what it had started as. Just his name. He was deeply grateful for that." They danced. She was a better dancer than he was, which also he had expected, and she did not draw attention to this fact except by leading slightly when he went wrong, so smoothly that no one could have known. They danced 3 dances and then stood at the edge of the floor with cups of lemonade and watched the fiddle player, who was very old and very good, and closed his eyes while he played. "Henry used to close his eyes like that when he played," she said, not with sadness exactly, but with the quiet noticing of someone who keeps inventory of the beautiful things. "Did he play often?" "Evenings, mostly. In the summer we would sit outside and he would play until the mosquitoes drove us in." Matthew listened. "You do not have to tread carefully around him," she said after a moment. "He was a good man and he is gone, and what I had with him is a closed and whole thing that I carry without difficulty. You are not a replacement, and I am not moving on from anything. I am just living forward, which is the only direction there is." He looked at her profile in the fiddle light. "You are remarkable, Mabel Covington," he said quietly. She turned to him. "I am very ordinary," she said. "I am just not dishonest about it." He shook his head. "No, you are not ordinary at all." She held his gaze for a moment with something in her eyes that was unguarded and warm, and then the fiddle swung into something fast and cheerful, and she grabbed his hand and pulled him back onto the floor. July came in hot and dry the way Texas July always did, the sky going white by 10 in the morning and the ground cracking in the afternoon heat. The corn was knee-high and doing well, the rows straight and green, and the South 20 had the McKinley sheep on it like a field of moving clouds. Old Scratch stood in the shade of the barn most afternoons with the characteristic expression of a creature who has earned some rest. Matthew came out on Saturdays without fail, and increasingly on other days when his work allowed it. He helped with fence repair and well maintenance, and the endless small labor of keeping a working farm going through summer heat. He learned the rhythms of the place, which creek crossing flooded after hard rain, which fence post was weakest and needed watching, where the wild plum trees grew along the north pasture edge, and that Mabel made the best preserve he had ever tasted from them. He learned her rhythms too. He learned that she was her best self in the early morning before the heat, and less good in the 3 o'clock hollow when the temperature peaked and the work was hardest. He learned that she thought through problems by talking about them obliquely, circling toward what she meant rather than stating it directly, which was actually the only way she differed from her usual directness. He learned that she liked silence as much as conversation, and that the two of them could spend a whole afternoon working side by side without speaking, and it was full rather than empty. He learned that she was sometimes lonely in a way she did not talk about directly, a loneliness that had nothing to do with company and everything to do with the particular species of quiet that settles on a person who has lost someone they expected to spend their life with. He did not try to fix this because it was not something to be fixed, but he tried to be the kind of presence that made it less acute, and he thought he was mostly succeeding. She learned him too. She learned that he was steadier than he seemed at first, that the quiet he carried was not coldness but depth. She learned that he laughed rarely, but that when he did it was genuine and full. She learned that he was kind in a practical way, not sentimental but reliably attentive to what was needed, and that this was actually his best quality. She learned that he had opinions about almost everything but held them lightly enough to be changed by good argument, which was rarer than it should have been. She found, over the long heat of July, that she was no longer simply grateful for his company. She had begun to want it specifically and urgently, to notice the gap in Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday where he was not there, to look toward the road on Saturday mornings earlier than was reasonable. She did not say this to him directly. She said it in other ways. She began setting an extra cup out when she heard hooves on the road. She set aside plum preserves for him and did not open the jar alone. When she made decisions about the farm, large or small, she found herself composing how she would tell him about them, not to ask permission, but because his response was part of how she processed what she thought. He noticed these things. He was paying very close attention. On the last Saturday of July, he came out and found her on the roof. She was repointing the mortar around the chimney, which was something that could have waited and she knew it, but she had been awake at 3 in the morning worrying about it, and at 4 in the morning she had decided to stop worrying by doing something about it. She was on the peak of the roof with a trowel and a bucket of mortar, and she was doing a careful and competent job of it. Matthew stood in the yard and looked up at her. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, not looking down, concentrating on a particular joint. "The chimney needs work," he said. "Found some cracking last week. Rather do it now than have water in the walls by fall. Do you want a second set of hands?" She did look down then from the peak of the roof, and the morning light was behind him, and he was looking up at her with that direct, quiet expression he had. No alarm at her being on a roof, no lecture about whether she should be up there, just genuine inquiry about whether he could help. She thought, quite clearly and with no particular surprise, that she was in love with this man. She had known it was coming. She had felt it assembling itself piece by piece through the months, the way a barn comes together, post by post and beam by beam, until suddenly it is unmistakably a barn. She had been aware of each individual piece, and now she was looking at the whole structure and it was solid and real. "Yes," she said. "Come on up." He climbed the ladder without drama, and she showed him what needed doing, and they worked on the chimney together through the morning with the landscape spread around them in every direction, the corn green and tall, the sheep white on the south 20, the roads going red and straight to the horizon. When they came down at noon and were standing in the yard washing their hands at the pump, she turned to him and said, "Matthew." He looked at her with water dripping off his forearms. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I am in love with you," she said. "I have been for some time, and I thought you should know it plainly." He stood very still with water on his hands and arms. "Mabel," he said. "You said you preferred the honest approach," she said. "So." He laughed then, that full and real laugh she had learned was rare and genuine, and he came toward her in 2 steps and took her face in his wet hands and kissed her properly, not as he had kissed her that first time in the barn, which had been careful and wondering, but the way a man kisses a woman when he has been wanting to and is no longer being careful about it. When they separated, she was breathless, and he had his forehead resting against hers. "I have been in love with you since you offered me a biscuit off a fence rail in the rain," he said. "That long," she said. "That exact moment," he said, No qualification. She pulled back and looked at him, and her eyes were bright. "Well," she said, "that simplifies things considerably." "It complicates them somewhat too," he said. "I need to have a different conversation with you now." She looked at him with those clear eyes. "I told you in the barn back in April that I would come back to ask you, at a point that seemed right to both of us, whether you would want a partner in the whole enterprise." He met her eyes steadily. "Mabel, I am asking." She was quiet for a moment that stretched. "You are asking me to marry you," she said. "I am asking you to marry me," he confirmed. She looked out across the farm at the corn and the sheep and the limestone house with its fresh chimney mortar, and then she looked back at him. "This farm is mine," she said. "I will not give up the deed or the title or the decisions about what happens on this ground. I have worked too hard for it." "I would not ask you to," he said immediately and without hesitation. She studied his face. "I have opinions about everything from crop rotation to which fence posts need replacing," she continued. "I am not easy to live with." "You are extraordinary to live near," he said. "I expect living with you would be considerably better." The corner of her mouth moved. "Yes," she said. "Matthew Barker, yes," he breathed out. "All right," he said. "Good." She laughed again, twice in one morning, which was unusual, and he thought he would like to be the cause of that sound as frequently as the world would allow. They were married in September. The ceremony was held at Reverend Poole's church in Harlan Creek on a Saturday morning, when the weather had finally broken, and the early fall had brought cool nights and warm days, and the whole land was golden with it. Mabel wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, white cotton with small buttons down the back and a high lace collar, and Matthew stood at the front of the church in the only suit he owned, which fit him well enough, and watched her come down the aisle with the morning light from the east window laid across her like a benediction. She looked at him the whole way down. Not at the church, not at the congregation, which included Judge Alderman and Reverend Poole's wife and old, Clyde Harmon from the feed store and the McKinley brothers and Walt Prout in his good hat. Just at him. When Reverend Poole said the words and they said theirs, Mabel's voice was steady and clear, and Matthew's was lower but equally steady. And when the Reverend said, "What God has joined together," and it was done, Matthew kissed his wife for the first time as her husband in front of the whole town and felt that he was exactly where he was supposed to be in the world. The corn had come in 3 weeks before the wedding. Not a record harvest, but a solid one, more than enough. The bank loan had been paid in full on September 3rd, 2 days before the deadline, and Matthew had been there when Mabel walked into the bank and put the money on Cresswell's desk in counted bills and coins. She did not say anything triumphant about it, which was somehow more triumphant than anything she could have said. Old Scratch received an extra portion of oats that evening and showed his appreciation by eating it with his usual air of complete entitlement. After the wedding, they went back to the farm, which was now their farm, and they did not go anywhere for a honeymoon because there was too much to do, and neither of them was the kind of person who needed to be elsewhere to appreciate what they had. They took supper late that evening after the well-wishers had come and gone, and the house was quiet, and the oil lamp burned on the kitchen table between them, and it was not so different from all the other evenings they had spent at this table except that it was entirely different. She had moved the extra chair to his side of the table. He noticed this. He reached across and took her hand on the table's surface, the same table where their hands had nearly touched 5 months earlier by the lamp flame, and she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. The fall was generous. The second cutting of hay came in well, and Walt Prout had his barn rebuilt by October, and there was a general sense among the farming community that the hard years were easing, which might have been optimism but felt real enough to act on. Matthew gave up the rented room above the hardware store and moved his small collection of belongings to the limestone house on the Covington farm, which he had taken to thinking of simply as home, a word that had not applied to any place in a long time. He had a conversation with Judge Alderman about the county work in November. He did not want to give it up entirely, because the income was useful, but he wanted to restructure his arrangement so that his primary base was the farm rather than town, which meant he could take cases in the wider county range rather than riding back and forth from Harlan Creek every day. The judge agreed to this with the expression of a man who had expected it. "I take it the widow Covington found the payment arrangement satisfactory," Alderman said. "Mrs. Barker," Matthew said, "would say that it was fair." Alderman smiled into his papers. "And you?" "I would say it was the best arrangement I ever made," Matthew said. They settled into married life in the way that two strong and particular people settle into a shared existence, with negotiation and grace and occasional friction, and the steady accumulation of small shared habits that become, over time, the architecture of a life. They argued about the crop rotation in the second spring, Matthew proposing winter wheat on the North 20 to rest the corn ground, Mabel convinced that the corn yield would hold another year with careful soil management, and that the wheat market was not reliable enough to justify the change. They argued about it across 2 suppers and 1 long argument in the barn, and ultimately landed on a compromise, half to wheat and half to continued corn, that neither of them had proposed at the start, but both of them found they preferred to their original positions. This would become characteristic of their disagreements. Matthew took on a deputy sheriff role in addition to the debt work, which brought a small additional wage, and more importantly gave him standing in the community in a way that sat easier with him than the debt work alone. He was a fair and patient man in the role, with good judgment and the particular temperament of someone who had spent years arriving at bad situations and trying to make them less bad, which was most of what the work required. Mabel took on a reputation in the community as a woman whose opinion about farming was worth having, which she had earned through 5 years of making the land pay in difficult circumstances, and which she accepted without false modesty. The McKinley brothers renewed their lease agreement and added another 10 acres. She added chickens and then a milk cow named Agnes, who was opinionated but productive, and the farm diversified and grew steadier year by year. They had been married nearly a full year when the February morning came that Mabel, setting Matthew's coffee on the table with an expression that was composed in a particular careful way, told him she was expecting. He was standing by the window with his coat half on, and he turned and looked at her, and she met his eyes and waited. He came to her in 2 steps and took her hands and looked at her face for a long moment. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am well," she said. "The early weeks have not been easy, but I am well. How long have you known?" 5 weeks. I wanted to be certain before I told you." He brought her hands up and pressed them against his chest, and she could feel his heart under them, steady and quick. "Mabel," he said. "I know," she said. They stood there in the morning kitchen with the February cold at the windows and Agnes making her particular commentary in the yard and the world outside white with frost, and neither of them said anything more for a while because nothing more needed to be said. Spring came and she grew, and the farm grew, and Matthew was relentlessly attentive in a way she sometimes found overwhelming and always found dear. He took over the heavier field work without comment or negotiation as the months advanced, not removing her from decisions or suggestions, but simply ensuring she was not doing the things that strained her. She caught him on 3 separate occasions having careful, quiet conversations with Old Scratch, who received these consultations with regal indifference. "What do you talk to him about?" she asked one evening. Matthew looked slightly caught. "The weather," he said, "the weather, and various matters of concern." "And what does he say?" "Mostly he tells me I am worrying unnecessarily," Matthew said, "which I find inconsistent coming from an animal who has never once completed a turn without argument." She laughed and leaned into his side, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood at the barn door in the April evening while Old Scratch turned away from them with studied dignity. The baby came in October. He came fast and with considerable determination, which Mabel said was fitting, and he arrived in the early morning hours while the first hard frost sparkled on the fields. Reverend Poole's wife served as midwife, and Matthew waited in the kitchen in a state of contained terror that he managed to keep mostly contained, heating water when asked and being where he was needed and saying very little. When the baby was finally placed in his arms, he looked down at a face that was red and annoyed about everything and entirely perfect, and he stood in the doorway of the room where Mabel lay exhausted and watching him, and he could not speak for a moment. "He is all right?" she asked. "He is perfect," Matthew said, which was not an objective assessment but was the truest thing he knew how to say. They named him James Henry Barker, James for Matthew's father and Henry for Mabel's first husband, because she said that to leave Henry entirely out of the naming would have been a small untruth, and the baby had come to a life built partly on ground Henry had loved, and that was worth acknowledging. Matthew agreed to this immediately, and found that he had never once been threatened by Henry Covington's memory, and that the naming felt honest and right. James was loud and hungry and slept in violent opposition to any schedule that his parents might have preferred, and he brought with him the particular joy and exhaustion of new parenthood in a working farmhouse, where there is no such thing as sleeping in, and the chores do not negotiate with infants. Mabel recovered quickly because she was constitutionally incapable of doing otherwise, and Matthew managed the winter farm work largely alone while she managed James, and they found a rhythm in this that was hard and good, and brought them closer in the specific way that shared difficulty does, not by removing hardship, but by navigating it together so that the experience becomes something owned jointly and permanently. By the following spring, Mabel was back in the fields, James in a basket in the barn's shade on mild days, and the farm moved forward in the way that working land does when the people on it are committed and attentive. Old Scratch was 10 years old by now, which was not young for a mule but was not old either, and he worked with the same tireless stubbornness he had always had, and Matthew had by now developed a complete and sincere respect for the animal. He told Mabel once that Old Scratch was the most honest creature on the property, meaning that the mule was exactly and always what he appeared to be, and there was no deception in him of any kind. "High praise from you," Mabel said. "I mean it as such," he said. The years moved in the way of good years, not without difficulty, because there is no such thing as a farming life without difficulty, but with the sense of forward motion and accumulating solidity that means a life is working. The drought of 1885 hit hard and they lost a portion of the corn crop and had to be careful for a winter, but the diversification of the farm that Mabel had built meant they were not ruined, and the following year was generous and replenished what had been lean. Matthew continued his deputy sheriff work through this period and became known across the county as someone worth consulting. He was fair and remembered the various ways that circumstances could trap people, which made him better at the work than the men who had come before him. He did not lose his essential character in the role, the habit of looking for the arrangement that served everyone better than the alternative, and the community recognized this even when they did not articulate it. Mabel built a reputation for what she had always been, the most competent farmer on this stretch of road, and she began to be consulted by neighbors about soil management and crop choices, which she did straightforwardly, and without making anyone feel that accepting advice from a woman was anything unusual, which was in itself a contribution to the general quality of things. They had their second child in the spring of 1886, a daughter they named Clara, who arrived in the morning of an April day that was clear and warm and full of birdsong. Clara was from the beginning a different kind of person than James, quieter and observant where he had been loud and insistent, and she watched the world from the beginning with large calm eyes that reminded Matthew, in a way he never mentioned to Mabel, of her mother. James, at 3 years old, was deeply unimpressed by Clara's arrival for approximately 1 week, and then became her most devoted protector for the rest of his childhood, which Clara tolerated with the equanimity she brought to all things. The farm with 4 people on it had a different quality than it had had before, fuller and louder and more itself somehow, as if the original limestone house had been waiting for this specific complement of occupants to become what it had always intended to be. In the late spring of 1887, on a Saturday morning with the smell of new corn on the air, Mabel came out to the barn where Matthew was working on a harness and stood in the doorway with her arms folded and a particular expression. "What?" he said. "I was thinking," she said, "about that first day." He looked up. "You sat on your horse at the edge of the field for a very long time," she said, "before you climbed down." "I did," he confirmed. "What were you thinking?" she asked. He set down the harness. "I was thinking that I had a paper in my pocket with a lawful purpose and that I could not make myself say the words." "Because of the rain?" she asked. "Because of you," he said. "Because you were plowing in the rain and the whole field was going to get planted whether I showed up or not, and something about that made the paper in my pocket feel like a very small thing." She was quiet. "I rode 7 miles to repossess a mule," he said, "and I ended up standing in a field wondering how to be useful instead." "You were useful," she said. "I fell in love," he said, which in the moment felt like a complication. She uncrossed her arms and came to him across the barn floor. "And now," she said, "now it feels like the central fact of my life," he said. "Everything else is arranged around it." She stood before him and looked up at him with those brown eyes that had never once looked at anything except what was true, and he put his hand against the side of her face the way he had that first time in this barn 5 years ago. "You should have repossessed the mule," she said, with a small smile. "Absolutely not," he said. She laughed and he kissed her, and in the yard James was chasing a chicken with enormous energy, and in the house Clara was likely asleep in her cradle with that particular expression of a person who has assessed the available information and found it satisfactory. And old Scratch was outside in the morning sun with his ears at that particular angle that meant he was content, and the corn was up, and the fence lines were straight, and the road went east toward town and west toward the horizon, and the world was wide open in every direction. The summer of 1887 brought a particular kind of richness to the Barker farm that Matthew had learned to recognize as the texture of a life that is functioning properly. James at 4 was a force of nature in the fields, following his father with intense seriousness, and his mother with equal seriousness, and occasionally issuing instructions to Old Scratch, who treated these instructions with the contempt they deserved. Clara, 1 year old and beginning to pull herself upright on anything available, watched all of this from her blanket in the shade with the expression of a scientist cataloging data. Matthew had been promoted to full sheriff by summer's end. The previous sheriff, Jim Cates, had decided that 20 years was enough and that New Mexico was calling him, and the county had voted in August, and the result was decisive enough that even Cates himself said it was the right outcome before he packed his belongings and rode west. Matthew accepted the position with the same quiet seriousness he brought to everything. The appointment meant more responsibility and a better wage and a greater claim on his time, and he and Mabel had long conversations over several evenings about what this would mean for the farm. He would need to be in town more frequently. She would need additional help during certain periods. They solved this practically, as they solved most things, by finding Walt Pruitt's youngest son Eli, 17 and strong and looking for work, who came on at the farm 2 days a week and proved to be reliable and willing. Mabel also hired a woman from town, a widow named Mrs. Harriet Cole, who came out 3 mornings a week to help with Clara and the household work, while the farm demanded Mabel's particular attention. And this arrangement worked well enough that Mabel wondered somewhat guiltily why she had not done it sooner. The answer was the cost, which was now manageable in a way it had not always been, and also a certain stubbornness about doing everything herself that she was slowly, through the accumulated evidence of years, learning to set aside. "You are allowed to ask for help," Matthew told her once during this period. "I know that," she said. "You have always been allowed," he said. She looked at him. "You sound like you are talking about something that started before Mrs. Cole." I am talking about a woman who plowed in the rain rather than ask her neighbor for a loan, he said, without any judgment in his voice, just accuracy. She was quiet for a moment. Walt Prout needed everything he had, she said. I know, he said. I am not criticizing. I am just saying that you do not always have to hold the weight alone. You have never had to, but particularly now. She reached across and pressed his hand. I know, she said more softly this time. That fall brought something unexpected in the form of Mabel's sister Ruth, who arrived from Missouri in October with her 2 eldest children and a wagon load of belongings, and a letter from her husband Samuel that explained he had found a job on the railroad that would take him through Texas for the winter, and would it be possible for them to stay a few months. It was a larger ask than the letter made it sound, and both Mabel and Matthew understood this. Ruth's children, a boy of 9 named Thomas and a girl of 7 named Anna, were pleasant enough, and Ruth herself was a warm and competent woman who pitched in without asking what needed doing, which Matthew appreciated. But the house was small, and 4 children and 6 adults was a significant reorganization of its available space and quiet. Matthew handled this by making a project of expanding the house. He had been thinking about it anyway. The limestone house was what it was, solid and good, but it had 2 bedrooms and a kitchen and a sitting room, which had been enough when it was Mabel alone, and then when it was the 2 of them, and then manageable when James arrived, but which was now definitively insufficient. He spent 3 weeks in the fall and early winter, with Walt's boy Eli and 2 hired men from town and Ruth's husband Samuel, who arrived in November and proved to be a capable builder, extending the house eastward by 2 full rooms. A proper second bedroom for the children, large enough for the beds that would be needed as James and Clara grew, and a room off the back that could be used for storage or, eventually, another child if that was what came. Mabel watched this construction with the expression of someone who is moved by a thing and is choosing to express it through practical assistance. She made coffee and meals and offered opinions on placement of windows and the height of the interior doorframe, and the question of whether the new floor should be timber or packed stone. Timber, Matthew said. Timber is more expensive, she said. Timber is warmer in winter and better for children's knees, he said. She looked at him. We have 2 now and possibly more, he said, and there will be years of crawling and falling and general proximity to floors, and I would prefer the floor to be timber. She put her hands on her hips and looked at the framing of the new room. Timber, she said. They put in timber. Ruth and Samuel stayed through the winter and left in March when the railroad moved Samuel's section south toward San Antonio. And they left with an emotional departure that included Ruth crying in the yard and Mabel not crying, but holding her sister for a long time, and Matthew and Samuel standing nearby with the particular expressions of men waiting for something to finish. Thomas and Anna said goodbye to James with the sorrow of children who have spent several months building a small civilization together and must now abandon it, and little Clara, who was now 1.5 and had definite opinions about most things, waved from Mabel's arms with an expression of queenly composure. After the wagon turned onto the road and the sound of it faded, Mabel stood in the yard for a moment, and Matthew came and stood beside her. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am always all right," she said, which they both knew to be mostly true. "Are you sad?" She leaned into him slightly. "Yes, but I will see her again." "You will," he agreed. "And the house is larger now," she said. "It is." She looked at the house, at the new section with its good timber floor and its 2 new rooms and the winter's worth of effort in its walls. "Thank you," she said. "It needed doing," he said. She turned and looked at him with those eyes and said, "Matthew Barker, accept a thank you," he smiled. "Thank you accepted." The years continued in the way of years, with seasons and work and children growing and the accumulating texture of a life lived on one piece of ground with intention and love. James grew from an energetic child to an earnest and capable boy who took serious interest in the farm by the time he was 7, and was genuinely helpful by 8, the kind of boy who listened carefully to instructions and then carried them out with the same focused diligence as his father. Clara grew from a watchful infant to a watchful child who asked more questions than anyone could easily answer, and had a gift for the kitchen garden that she seemed to have inherited directly from no one obvious but exercised with great authority. Old Scratch was getting older. By 1889 he was 17, which was a respectable age for a mule, and he was still working but more slowly, and with a certain deliberateness of pace that Matthew chose to interpret as wisdom rather than age. The veterinarian from Harlan Creek, a young man named Dr. Hollies, who had come to the county from Virginia 2 years prior, came out to look at him in the fall of that year, and said that the mule was in good condition for his age and had no specific complaint beyond the general one, which was the passage of time. Matthew found this report oddly moving. He stood in the barn with the veterinarian's words settling around him and looked at Old Scratch, who stood with his usual combination of dignity and complete indifference to human emotion. That evening he told Mabel about the visit and she listened. "He will not work forever," she said. "No," Matthew agreed. "When the time comes," she said, "he will have lived a full life. He pulled the plow that saved this farm. That is not a small thing." "No," Matthew agreed again. "We will take good care of him until then," she said, with the matter-of-fact tenderness she brought to all matters of practical concern. "And when it ends with everything it should have." He nodded. "Then, because it was true," he said, "he pulled the plow that brought me here." She looked at him. "If the debt was different, or the animal was different, or if he had not been part of the note, I would have had no reason to come to this farm on that particular morning." "And never seen me plowing in the rain," she said softly. "And never seen you plowing in the rain," he confirmed. She moved to him across the kitchen and stood with her hands flat on his chest and looked up at him. "I think about that morning sometimes," she said, "not with sadness, just with wonder, all the things that had to happen exactly as they did." "Henry had to take the loan," Matthew said. "The bank had to default him," she said. "The judge had to give the paper to me. And you had to ride out on a rainy morning," she said, "and then you had to be the kind of man who could not make himself speak the words." He put his arms around her. "I sat on my horse in the rain," he said, "and I watched you and I thought about all the reasons to say what I had come to say, and not one of them was enough." She pressed her face briefly against his shirt. "I am glad," she said. "So am I," he said. The spring of 1890 came sweet and mild, the best planting weather in a decade, according to old Clyde Harmon, who had been tracking such things since before Matthew was born, and whose assessments of weather were treated by the farming community as canonical. The fields went in early and well, and by April the Barker farm was as green and prosperous-looking as it had been in any year of its life. Mabel told Matthew in late April that she was expecting again. She told him in the evening at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, in the same composed and direct manner she had told him the first time, and he took her hands in the same way he had taken them the first time and held them against his chest. "Our third," he said. "Our third," she confirmed. "How do you feel?" "Well," she said, "better than either time before." "James will be pleased," he said. "He has been hoping for a brother." "Clara will be pleased in her own way," Mabel said, "which will involve a great deal of data collection and eventual synthesis." He laughed because this was exactly correct. The summer of 1890 was warm and good, and the corn came in strong and the wheat that they now planted on the North 20 came in better. Matthew's work as sheriff was steady and mostly uneventful through this period, the normal business of a county that was settled and growing, the disagreements and small transgression, and the occasional situation that required more than ordinary patience to resolve without making things worse. He was good at the job. He was good at it in the way that Mabel was good at the farm, not through brilliance or ease, but through the relentless application of good judgment and the willingness to keep trying. The third child arrived in November, a boy, as James had hoped. They named him Robert after no one in particular, because he arrived looking entirely himself, and both of his parents felt that he deserved a name that was not pre-inhabited by anyone else's history. Robert was from the beginning a person of enormous will and complete cheerfulness, combining traits that Matthew found simultaneously exhausting and deeply endearing. He cried loudly, laughed loudly, slept loudly in some fashion that defied the usual associations between sound and sleep, and regarded the world with an enthusiasm that suggested he found everything about it extremely promising. James, at 7, took the arrival of a brother with profound satisfaction, and immediately began planning the things they would do together when Robert was large enough to be a useful companion, a timeline that James estimated at approximately 1 year, and Matthew estimated at considerably more. Clara, 5 now, inspected Robert with the systematic attention she brought to everything, and her verdict, delivered on the evening of his second day, was, "He seems like he will be interesting," which was high praise from Clara. The family lived in the extended limestone house that was now genuinely large enough for all of them, though barely, and the farm went into the 1890s with the steady productive rhythm of a place that has been worked well for years, and has begun to pay that labor back in the accumulated fertility of well-maintained land and the established infrastructure of a functional operation. Old Scratch worked one more spring, and then, in the summer of 1891, stopped working. Not dramatically, not with crisis, just with the gradual and unargued diminishment of an animal whose good long life had run its full course. Matthew and Mabel and the children kept him through the summer in the pasture with good grass and water, and the old mule stood in the shade and watched the goings-on of the farm with his long-established expression of complete ownership, and the children brought him apples and crusts of bread and spoke to him with the particular reverence reserved for creatures who have been around since before memory. Old Scratch died on a September morning quietly and in his sleep, which was everything a working animal deserved. Matthew found him at sunrise and told Mabel, and they stood together in the pasture for a moment before the day's demands began. "He lived 19 years, Matthew said. "The last 9 of them here." "He lived well," Mabel said. "He worked hard and he had good care and he had children who brought him apples." James and Clara and Robert, informed at breakfast, received the news with the seriousness it warranted. James said Old Scratch had been the best mule in the county. Clara said she would like to mark the grave with a stone, which she did, a flat piece of red limestone with his name cut into it by a man in town who did such work. Robert, 14 months old, looked at the stone and patted it several times with great seriousness, and then returned to the project of trying to reach the thing he had been trying to reach before the interruption. On the evening of the day they buried Old Scratch, Matthew and Mabel sat on the porch after the children were in bed, the fall evening warm enough and the stars out in their multitudes. The farm lay around them in the dark, the fields going to their fall quiet, the barn with its new mule, a younger animal named Luther who was only 3 and had a long working life ahead, settled for the night. "When you rode out here that morning," Mabel said, in the reflective tone she sometimes took when she was assembling something she had been thinking about, "what did you think this place was?" "I thought it was a farm with a debt problem," he said. "And now," he looked out at the dark land. "Home," he said simply. She reached over and took his hand on the porch railing. The night moved around them, easy and warm, and the stars did what stars in Texas always did, which was to fill up the whole sky in a way that made a person feel both very small and entirely at peace with being so. "Matthew," she said, "yes. I am glad you came that morning. I am glad you sat on your horse and could not speak the words. I am glad for all of it, even the hard parts, especially the hard parts." He turned to look at her in the dark, his wife of 9 years, the woman who had plowed a field in the rain and offered him biscuits off a fence rail, and told him plainly one summer morning that she loved him, the woman who had built this farm from almost nothing and raised their children with the same straight-line determination she brought to every furrow, the woman who was the central fact of everything he knew as good in his life. "I am glad, too," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together on the porch of the house they had built, and the farm they had grown, and the life they had made from a debt paper and a rainy morning and one stubborn gray mule. And the night was full and wide, and the future stretched ahead of them in every direction, with all its seasons and all its work and all its love still to be lived. The stars above the Llano Estacado turned slow and brilliant in the September dark. The crops were in. The children slept. The new mule stood quiet in the barn. The red limestone stone at the edge of the north pasture marked a name that was part of the story, as everything was part of the story: the drought and the debt and the rain and the plow, and the moment when a man rode 7 miles with a purpose and arrived at something else entirely. The farm breathed around them in the way that working land breathes, with the accumulated life of every season and every hand that had turned it. And Mabel's hand was in Matthew's hand, and the night was their own, and it would go on being their own for all the years that remained to them, through harvests good and lean, and children grown and grandchildren come, through all the ordinary, extraordinary passages of a life lived fully on one particular piece of ground. And that was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.